What happens when someone says something so profound on live television that the entire studio freezes and the host can't hold back tears? The elderly man's voice cracked as he held the microphone. "Mr. Harvey, what kept me alive wasn't medicine. It was a promise I made to my granddaughter before she—" He couldn't finish. Steve Harvey's smile vanished. The game board behind him suddenly seemed irrelevant. The cameras captured the exact moment when Family Feud stopped being a game show and became something else entirely. What Steve did next would break every rule of television and restore everyone's faith in humanity. It was supposed to be just another taping of Family Feud. The Johnson family versus the Martinez family. Standard format, 5 rounds, fast money, commercial breaks timed to the second. The producers had the rundown memorized. Question 1. Name something you do when you can't sleep. Simple. Safe. Perfect for daytime television. The elderly man, Richard Johnson, 84 years old, stood at the leftmost podium. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the buzzer. His family had insisted he come. "Dad, you never do anything fun anymore," his daughter had said. "Just come play the game with us." Steve Harvey walked onto the stage with that signature energy, that $1,000,000 smile, ready to make America laugh for 30 minutes. He looked at the Johnson family lineup, daughter, son-in-law, grandson, granddaughter, and Richard at the end. "All right, Johnson family, let's get it." Steve's voice boomed through the studio. The audience clapped on cue. Everything was going according to script. But nobody knew that Richard had almost not come today. Nobody knew what he was carrying in his jacket pocket. And nobody knew that in exactly 4 minutes, the entire show would come to a halt. Round 1 started normally. Steve read the question. The families buzzed in. Answers lit up on the board. "Reading! Good answer!" The audience applauded. Standard television. Richard stood quietly at his podium, watching his family play. His daughter glanced back at him, worried. She knew he hadn't been the same since that day 3 years ago. The day everything changed. The day they buried his granddaughter Emma, age 7, cancer. The game continued. Round 2. Round 3. Richard hadn't buzzed in once. He just stood there, hands resting on the podium, a faint smile on his weathered face. Steve noticed. Between questions, he would glance at the old man, something in his expression that Steve couldn't quite read. Then came the question that changed everything. "All right, folks, here we go," Steve announced, reading the card. "We surveyed 100 people. Top 7 answers on the board." He paused for dramatic effect, as he always did. "Name something that keeps people going during the hardest times of their lives." The studio audience murmured. It was a heavier question than usual. The producers had debated including it, but decided it would create emotional engagement. They had no idea. Richard's hand moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just a slow, deliberate reach toward the buzzer. His family looked at him, surprised. This was the first time all game he'd shown interest in answering. He pressed it. The buzzer sound echoed through the studio. Steve turned, eyebrows raised. "Oh, Grandpa's got something to say." "All right, Richard, what keeps people going during the hardest times?" Richard lifted the microphone. The studio lights felt suddenly brighter. His family watched him. The camera operators zoomed in, following standard protocol for family reactions. What came out of Richard's mouth was not an answer they had on the board. "Mr. Harvey." Richard's voice was quiet but steady. "What kept me alive wasn't medicine. Wasn't therapy. Wasn't anything the doctors could prescribe." He paused, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. "It was a promise I made to my granddaughter before she died." The studio went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning. Steve Harvey's smile slowly faded. His hand, which had been gesturing theatrically, dropped to his side. The producers in the booth froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial. "She was 7 years old," Richard continued, his voice now breaking. Emma. Brain cancer. She fought for 2 years. 2 years of treatments, hospitals, pain. He pulled something from his pocket, a small, worn photograph. 3 days before she passed, she made me promise something. Steve Harvey did something he never done in 15 years of hosting Family Feud. He put down his cards. He walked away from his mark. He walked directly to Richard, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the game board, ignoring every television protocol that existed. What did she ask you to promise? Steve's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught it. Nobody in that studio was thinking about the game anymore. Nobody was thinking about points or prizes. The entire world had just shrunk to an 84-year-old man and the promise he'd made to a dying child. Richard held up the photograph. The cameras zoomed in. It showed a little girl with no hair, wearing a hospital gown, smiling bigger than the sun. Next to her, Richard, 3 years younger, wearing a ridiculous party hat she'd insisted he put on. She said, "Grandpa, promise me you won't stop living. Promise me you'll do something fun every week. Promise me you'll laugh until your belly hurts. Because if you stop living, it means the cancer won, and I didn't fight this hard for the cancer to win." Steve Harvey's hand went to his mouth. His eyes, usually full of mischief and laughter, filled with tears. The audience was silent except for the sound of tissues being pulled from purses, the soft sounds of crying. "So I promised her," Richard said. "I promised I would live. Really live. Not just exist." He looked at his daughter, tears streaming down her face. "That's why I came here today. Because Emma loved this show. She used to watch it every day in the hospital. She'd shout out answers from her bed. And she'd say, 'Grandpa, if you ever go on that show, you better make Steve Harvey laugh.'" Steve Harvey was not laughing. Steve Harvey was crying. Openly. Completely. The man who made millions laugh every week was standing on national television with tears running down his face. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The director didn't call cut. Even the competing Martinez family had stepped away from their podium, many of them crying. Steve put his hand on Richard's shoulder. "Sir, I need you to know something." His voice was thick with emotion. "Your granddaughter is watching this right now. I don't care what anybody believes. That little girl is watching, and she's proud of you." Richard nodded, unable to speak. Steve continued, "And she's right. You kept your promise. You're here. You're living." He looked at the camera, speaking directly to America. "This man right here. This is what courage looks like. This is what love looks like." The audience stood up. All of them. Standing ovation. Not for a game show answer. Not for entertainment. For a man who chose life over grief. For a promise kept to a dying child. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the producer in the booth, speaking through his mic pack. "I don't care about the schedule. This show is about families, and right now, this family needs a moment." He took off his jacket. The expensive, tailored suit jacket he wore on every show. He draped it over Richard's shoulders. "This is yours now," Steve said. "And whenever you wear it, remember that you've got millions of people who just heard your story, who just witnessed your love, and who are going to live a little better because of what you shared today." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. His personal number. He handed it to Richard. "I want you to call me. Not next week. Not next month. Tomorrow. Because you and I are going to set up something special. A foundation. In Emma's name. For kids fighting cancer. And we're going to make sure that her fight, her courage, matters beyond this moment." The cameras were still rolling. This wasn't in the script. None of this was planned. But it was the most real moment Family Feud had ever broadcast. Richard looked at the card, then at Steve. "You'd do that? For Emma?" "No, sir. Steve shook his head, still crying. We're doing it with Emma. Because she's still here. She's in you. She's in this promise you kept. And now she's going to be in every child we help. The audience erupted again. The Martinez family crossed the stage, embracing the Johnson family. Competitors became comrades. The game was forgotten. Humanity had taken over. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Richard reached into his other pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. His hands were shaking as he handed it to Steve. Emma wrote you a letter. Before she died. She made me promise to give it to you if I ever met you. Steve Harvey, the man who'd seen everything in his decades of television, looked at the envelope like it was made of gold. His hands trembled as he opened it. The studio was so quiet you could hear the paper unfold. The cameras zoomed in on Steve's face as he read. Silent tears became sobs. His shoulders shook. Finally, he looked up at the audience, at Richard, at America watching at home. She wrote. Steve had to stop, compose himself. She wrote, Dear Mr. Harvey, my name is Emma and I'm 7 years old. I have cancer but I'm not scared because my grandpa makes me laugh every day, just like you make him laugh. If you're reading this, it means I'm already in heaven, but I have one request. Please make sure my grandpa keeps laughing. He's going to be sad, but tell him I want him to be happy. Tell him I'm okay. And tell him thank you for being the best grandpa in the whole world. Love, Emma. P.S. You have a really funny mustache. The entire studio broke. The laughter threw tears. The beautiful, painful, perfect mixture of joy and sorrow. Steve laughed despite his tears. She said I have a funny mustache. He showed the letter to the camera. Even from heaven, this little girl is roasting me. The audience laughed and cried simultaneously. It was cathartic. It was healing. It was television at its most human. Steve turned back to Richard. Sir, you didn't just keep a promise. You honored a life. You turned grief into purpose. And you taught all of us watching that love doesn't end, it transforms. He addressed the audience directly. This is bigger than a game show. This is about what matters. Family. Love. Promises. Legacy. He looked at the camera. Emma Johnson, if you're watching from heaven, sweetie, your grandpa did good. Real good. And we're going to make sure your name lives on forever. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The show never finished its normal format that day. The producers scrapped the scoring. There was no fast money round. Instead, they aired the entire 20-minute exchange, uncut. It became the most watched episode in Family Feud history. Over 50 million views online in the first week. But the real impact happened afterward. Steve Harvey kept his promise. Within 3 months, the Emma Johnson Foundation was established. Funding childhood cancer research. Supporting families. Creating joy in hospital rooms. The foundation's logo, a little girl with a party hat, smiling bigger than the sun. Richard became a regular visitor to children's cancer wards, sharing Emma's story, keeping his promise to live fully. Steve would join him twice a year, bringing laughter to the places that needed it most. The jacket Steve gave Richard that day hangs in the foundation's headquarters now, displayed in a glass case with Emma's photograph. Richard wore it to every foundation event until he passed away peacefully in his sleep 5 years later, age 89. His family found him with Emma's photograph in his hand and a smile on his face. At his funeral, Steve Harvey delivered the eulogy. Richard taught me that the measure of a life isn't in its length, but in its love. He turned his deepest pain into his greatest purpose. He kept a promise to a 7-year-old girl, and in doing so, he changed thousands of lives. The legacy lives on. The Emma Johnson Foundation has raised over $40 million for childhood cancer research. More than 3,000 families have received support. 15 children have received life-saving treatments they couldn't have afforded otherwise. All because an 84-year-old man kept a promise. All because Steve Harvey stopped a game show and chose humanity over television. The letter Emma wrote to Steve is now displayed in the Foundation's office, next to Richard's jacket. Visitors often stand there, reading her words, crying, then leaving inspired to live more fully, love more deeply, and keep the promises that matter. And somewhere, somehow, a 7-year-old girl with a party hat is smiling, proud of her grandpa who kept his word, proud of the man who stopped his show to honor a promise, and proud that her fight meant something beyond her years. The game show moment that became a movement. The promise that became a foundation. The love that refused to end. That's the day Steve Harvey stopped Family Feud and reminded us all what really matters. Years later, television critics would call it the moment reality TV became actually real. Students in communication courses study the episode as a masterclass in authentic human connection. The unscripted moment when entertainment gave way to truth. When ratings became irrelevant and humanity took center stage. Steve Harvey himself said in an interview years later, "I've made people laugh for decades. But that day with Richard and Emma's story, that's the day I understood my real purpose. Not to entertain, but to honor. To witness. To hold space for the moments that matter." The episode never aired with commercial breaks. Networks kept it intact, understanding some moments are too sacred to interrupt. It's shown in hospitals, grief counseling centers, and homes where people need to remember that love transcends loss.